Welcome, everyone. We are waiting a bit for everyone to come. Okay, then we will start. Okay, let me start then. Good evening, everyone. First of all, welcome. Today we gather for the second of our two two-part series in the memory of Cornell Fleischer and in the celebration of his remarkable collection donated to the Sunakuraç Library. And to give you a bit of background, earlier this year we got a total of 1869 materials from Professor Fleischer's collection. And since their arrival, our team has been working with great care to process, catalog, and prepare the materials for use. And today we are very pleased to share around 1,188 items are already ready to meet our users. And we are doing everything we can to make the entire collection accessible as soon as possible. And we would like to express our sincere gratitude to everyone who helped bring this invaluable collection to Sunakuraç Library. And today's session focuses on Cornell Fleischer as an Ottoman historian. And we are honored to be joined by distinguished speakers. First of all, Şahin from the Ohio State University, and who will also serve as our moderator. Nükhet Varlık from Rutgers University-Newark, and Christopher Markiewicz from Ghent University. On this day, as we commemorate the life and scholarship of Cornell Fleischer, I would like to extend our heartfelt thanks to all our speakers for being here. And before giving the floor to Şahin, let me share a couple of technical notes for our participants. Your cameras and microphones will remain automatically disabled. If you have any questions, please type them in the chat box, and during the Q&A session, our speakers will address them. I would also like to note that the recording of this event will be shared on the Sunakuraç Library's YouTube channel. And thank you again. And now I would like to pass the word to Şahin for beginning the session. Hocam, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much for organizing these panels. As you mentioned, this is the second one of a two-panel series on the legacy of our mentor, Cornell Fleischer. The first one was about Cornell's training and his approach to overall Islamic history beyond the Ottomans. But obviously, Cornell is mostly known as an Ottomanist, and he primarily wrote on the Ottoman Empire. So we thought we should do a second panel to talk about his legacy on the field of Ottoman studies as well. I would like to thank the Sunakuraç Library for hosting these panels, but also for hosting Cornell's book collection. A lot of people were involved in that process. I would like to thank Chris Markiewicz, present here, who donated these books in Cornell's name. This is a wonderful home for his books, and a lot of people came together to make it happen, which makes us very happy as his students that his books found a new home in Turkey for the next generation of scholars. I'm here in the company of my colleagues and friends, Chris Markiewicz and Nükhet Varlık. They will deliver their remarks about Cornell's legacy. On a personal note, all three of us were very close to Cornell, academically as well as personally. So it is particularly meaningful for me to be in this platform together with Chris and Nükhet. So let me introduce Chris first of all. Chris received his PhD from the Department of Near Eastern Languages and Cultures at the University of Chicago in 2015. But even before, he was a big college student at the University of Chicago. He also received his BA from the University of Chicago. So his training with Cornell goes even earlier than his time as a doctoral student at the University of Chicago. Chris is a historian of the Ottoman Empire with a particular focus on political, social, and intellectual history between the 15th and the 17th centuries. Many of you will be familiar with his book, The Crisis of Kingship in Late Medieval Islam, Persian Emigres and the Making of Ottoman Sovereignty, published by Cambridge in 2019. It really is a wonderfully accomplished book in which we see how ideas about the history and nature of kingship in the Ottoman Empire were connected with wider intellectual, cultural, and religious currents across the Islamic world. Chris also published on diplomatic history, the circulation of intellectuals and ideas, and historical writing in Islamic lands in the 15th and 16th centuries. I would like to highlight an edited collection that he did with Tracy Sowerby called Diplomatic Cultures at the Ottoman Court, circa 1500-1630. More recently, as if all that weren't enough, he received a major ERC grant called Islamic Endowments and State Formation in the Ottoman Empire, 1450-1650. He is working on the role of pious endowments in the development of the Ottoman state within the wider context of the transitions that we observe in the Islamic lands. And he's currently working at the University of Ghent in Belgium. Chris.
Wow, Kaya, thank you for that extensive introduction. And I'm very happy to be here with you, Kaya and Nükhet, and thank you very much to Zeynep and Irem and others and Harika for organizing this event. When I was asked to join this event, the brief was to speak say something about the impact of Cornell's scholarship and say something perhaps about the interpersonal dimension. And as I thought about this, I mean, I thought that actually the two for Cornell were often very wrapped up. I mean, if I think about Cornell's scholarship, he was someone who was especially interested in doing history to a very high level, but his commitment to it was very personal. And that was evident in his scholarship, and that was evident in the kinds of approach that he took to his work, his research, and his writing. He was really interested, I would say, in doing history at a personal level and exploring the human dimension of, especially the Ottoman Empire, let's say. And so, I'll in my 10 minutes or so, I'd like to say something about his scholarly impact in this regard, but then also something about his interpersonal impact as a scholar and a mentor and a teacher and all of these things. And when I think about Cornell, I think about him quite often, still perhaps every day, but I'm often now also teaching about Cornell, or rather teaching about his scholarship and teaching about what his impact was on the field to undergraduates now here in Belgium or graduate students here in Belgium. And when I try to think about what Cornell was for the field and what he still is for the field, I think I often go back actually to his book, the book on Mustafa Ali, where in the introduction he lays out very clearly a kind of ambition that he has for this work. But I think it's an ambition that really carried over and throughout all of his work. Here he's writing in the early 1980s, and he's looking at a field where the archives are opening up in considerable ways, and many great scholars, such Barkan and Inalcik and many others, are making use of archival materials to articulate and establish, let's say, the institutional dimensions of the empire, which Cornell drew the analogy to the skeleton. It is through the work of people like Barkan and Inalcik that we had, certainly by the 70s or early 80s, a very clear idea of the skeletal structure. And yet, as important as that aspect was, and Cornell certainly acknowledged it, Cornell was interested in the other aspect of the human, which is to say, flushing out the organs and tissues, the arteries, those aspects of the human body that give it, as he put it, organic reality. And that it's through this organic reality that we have life within this skeletal institutional structure. And that was certainly something that he aspired to, and he stated very clearly in his book. And that book is clearly a testament to that approach and his success in doing that. I mean, it had a huge impact on the field, certainly in the 80s, but I think that it's an impact that, for a number of reasons, resonated for decades. Really, what he was calling for was a kind of a shift from, not to forget about the skeletal structure. I mean, the skeletal structure is essential, but rather by focusing on the human dimension, sometimes a very personal, individual human dimension, a different kind of picture would emerge. And so that kind of approach is certainly at the center of the book, where he focuses on Mustafa Ali. It's a book that is certainly concerned with understanding bureaucratic structures in a certain sense, but it does so through a very personal approach by focusing on one man who, there's a lot that can be said about Mustafa Ali, the kind of the good, the bad, and the ugly. But Cornell handled that life with a real sensitivity, and as a result, his insights were really far-reaching, and they were far-reaching, I think, within the field of Ottoman studies, and also more broadly, well beyond the field of Ottoman studies. But this is an approach that you can see following through, his later work, as he, in the 1990s, when he becomes interested in, the impact of apocalyptic anxieties of the 16th century, or thinking about the impact of those anxieties on Ottomans articulating a new conception of rule during Suleiman's era. The approach is still highly personal. So, it's no longer Mustafa Ali, but it's people like Haidar-i-Ramal, or, later, well, actually even in the 90s, people like Abdurrahman al-Bistami, where, the approach is still significantly biographical, and yet there's a lot that can be done with that or through that to eliminate whole terrains which historians hadn't previously thought much about before. Um, and so, it's through this, in some ways, very personal, very somehow biographical approach that Cornell also connected with much wider fields, I would say. Perhaps he was coming around at a very opportune time in the 80s, when Europeanists perhaps were beginning to think more seriously about the Ottoman Empire. Certainly, there were a number of greater interest and exhibits in Suleiman and his era in the early 90s. But it's also through interactions with other scholars, his peers, people like Sanjay Subrahmanyam, that I think Cornell has a kind of wider impact on early modern history and how we think about it. And so I mentioned Sanjay Subrahmanyam because at the moment in the 90s, when Cornell is especially interested in thinking about, what the apocalypse meant in the mid 16th century and what it meant for articulations of rule, it's through conversations with Sanjay Subrahmanyam that Sanjay develops a kind of idea about connected histories, which has an enormous impact on global history, on historians thinking about global history today, thinking about how in the 16th century millennial anxieties and widespread patterns of situating a sovereign within a much wider cosmic framework is not solely an Ottoman concern, but is really something that is widespread across Eurasia. And Cornell, through conversations with colleagues like Sanjay Subrahmanyam, was at the forefront of that kind of very creative historical thinking. And so this relationship also highlights, I would say, something else that's important about Cornell, which is I would say the interpersonal relationships that he maintained throughout his life. And here I would speak about this interpersonal relationships on two levels. One, the first is with his peers, people like Sanjay Subrahmanyam or Serpil Bağcı, the art historian, or Gülrün Necipoglu, or Jamal Kafadar. He spent many hours speaking with them over the phone or later by Skype. And it's through, I think, prolonged, in some ways, decades spanning conversations with these people that he developed certainly his historical thinking, and I think that they benefited as well from interaction with him. The other, let's say, dimension of the kind of interpersonal and the way that the interpersonal aspect has a wider impact on the field, I think, is through his training of students and his the relationships that he developed with students, by virtue of, his place at the University of Chicago, and by virtue of a kind of growing interest in the United States, I would say, in Ottoman studies in the 90s and 2000s and 2010s. Cornell had, taught a great number of students. So of course I'm among them, and as is Kaya and Nükhet, but we're really only three of, I don't know, it's very hard to count. I mean, at least a dozen who are now professors in the United States and Canada, and a number of countries in Europe, including Turkey. And so Cornell, through this interpersonal dimension, I think has a really important impact on the field and how the field kind of is continuing to develop, perhaps especially, I would say, in North America. Um, and so, I mean, before I'll wrap up, I mean, I will say maybe a little bit about this interpersonal dimension. I was trying to think, about what this interpersonal dimension meant for Cornell and his approach to books and his approach to, or the place, let's say, of Istanbul for him. Books were something that was very important to Cornell. I mean, he developed, a very nice collection, and it's a collection that is not just Ottoman, but is really, concerned with all aspects of Islamic culture and Islamic history. And, therefore, the books are a kind of personal reflection of who Cornell was. And so, I mean, in that regard, I'm very happy that Koç University has these books, because they're now available to a new generation, or hopefully many generations of students and scholars. The other aspect, I think about Cornell and I think about Istanbul. Cornell, as a child, actually spent many years in Cairo, and he used to say that Cairo was a kind of real home for him. But it was also very clear in the way that he spoke about and in the way that he moved about Istanbul, that Istanbul was also a real home for him. I mean, in 2012 and 2013, I spent a year in Istanbul doing my dissertation research, and I felt very lucky that Cornell actually spent the spring and several months in 2013 and in Istanbul, and we were there together. We were in Taksim during Gezi days together. But I also remember, something quite personal, which is that, I was in the midst of doing my dissertation on Idris Bitlisi, who wrote a massive Persian chronicle, and I wanted to read some very difficult passages of the introduction where Bitlisi was talking about some aspects of kingship. And, Cornell invited me over to where he was staying, and we sat down to read this introduction together. And it was a very intense experience, because it lasted something like three or 3.5 hours, reading, discussing line by line. And this is the kind of thing that he did with many of his students. It shows something about his commitment to learning, but also, I think, his commitment to books. Books were valued for him. And having that kind of interaction with him in Istanbul was incredibly meaningful for me. And I think it's a wonderful thing that his collection is winding up in Istanbul, where many people will have access to them. I'll stop there.
Thank you so much, Chris, for these wonderful remarks that bring Cornell closer to us personally, as well as from an academic perspective. Our next presenter is Nükhet Varlık from Rutgers University. Nükhet received her PhD from the University of Chicago as well, from the Department of Near Eastern Languages and Cultures in 2008. And she then wrote, based on her dissertation, the first systematic scholarly study of the Ottoman experience of the plague during the Black Death pandemic and the following centuries. She published it as Plague and Empire in the Early Mediterranean World, the Ottoman Experience, 1347-1600. with Cambridge University Press. The book received not one, not two, not three, but many, many more prestigious prizes in the field of Ottoman and Turkish studies, in the field of medieval Mediterranean history, history of medicine. She also edited Plague and Contagion in the Islamic Mediterranean, and more recently, she co-edited, together with Laurie Jones, Death and Disease in the Medieval and Early Modern World, Perspectives from Across the Mediterranean and Beyond. Nükhet's new project is tentatively called Empire, Ecology, and Plague, Rethinking the Second Pandemic circa 1340s, circa 1940s, which is going to make a major impact on a number of different fields when it appears. You also may be familiar with Nükhet through different channels, as she is a sought-after expert on plague, disease, epidemics, already before the COVID pandemic, but particularly during and after COVID, when the subjects that she studies basically became even more prominent in our thinking of the human experience. So, Nükhet, the floor is yours.
All right, thank you, Kaya. Thank you for the organizers of today's event. It is a pleasure to be part of this event, and to talk about not only Cornell's legacy, but also to witness how the legacy continues with the transfer of his library to Koç University Library. It's a great pleasure to know that the legacy of Cornell Fleischer will continue, and this will be something that will add to it. So what I am going to try to talk about today is basically this legacy. And I was thinking about like what more can be said about Cornell here, about his scholarship, about his as a professor for mentoring basically the next generation of Ottoman historians, and also for setting a model as a scholar and a mentor that many of us try to emulate. And I will try to offer my own personal reflections, but I will try to emphasize the theme of that legacy as something that continues and that will continue to inform the work of the generations of Ottoman historians to come. So it's been an extremely important privilege, I think, that I had the opportunity to enjoy, to have worked with Professor Cornell Fleischer, to have known him, to have studied under his supervision, and also to have been colleagues and I can say friends for the last 2 decades or more. And I can definitely say, no doubt that he's been one of the most important people in my life, not only as my former supervisor, as a colleague, but also as a model scholar and as a model person to follow. So Cornell scholarship, I think there is really no need to repeat this again, but his work has been transformative in the field of Ottoman studies, Ottoman history, and also in terms of its connections to the world around it. And for many fields related to Ottoman studies, I think we can also trace Cornell's scholarship influence in opening up new frontiers, new research, new questions, and bringing in new themes for the study of historians. But more than that, more than the legacy continuing through his publications and scholarship, I think we can also trace his legacy in his contributions and in his direct involvement in the field. And this he did through service to the field. In many of the organizations, he took active part, and the universities and training students, of course, and maintaining connections with his colleagues, as Chris emphasized, maintaining some of these long-term, lifelong friendships and collegial connections. And especially he really paid great attention to maintaining relationship with his colleagues in Turkey, with institutions in Turkey, and he was always in touch with a scholarship in Turkey and never wanted to be disconnected from it or just only being kind of limited in the study of Ottoman history in the US or the Western world only. And so this was important for him and for training students, and for his 3 decades of his work at the University of Chicago as Kanuni Süleyman Professor of Ottoman and Turkish Studies. He trained a number of students, and I believe that it is objectively true to say that his legacy continues through his former students, and hopefully the students that are being trained on that will be trained by his former students. So in a way, we can see his impact in line with the older Ottoman tradition of training students, in the silsila tradition of kind of, setting an example and setting a personal example in doing that. And also he was the kind of professor who was always very generous with his students in terms of sharing research, and always sharing the sense of curiosity, and almost, I could say, like a joyful, childlike curiosity in learning and discovering new things. Cornell as a scholar and as a mentor, and how he set this model and the impact and the legacy. And in many regards, I think we can say that he pioneered new questions, as Chris beautifully reminded us of what his landmark book on Mustafa Ali, how beautifully it put together the main new intervention for the time, putting flesh on the skeleton. And by doing that, he basically opened up this new front or new perspective for allowing a whole new set of questions to be asked to approach Ottoman history. But more than that, I think one thing we can say about Cornell's scholarship, apart from the scholarship itself, was his approach to his historical actors. And I think in that way, he's unique. And I think in that way also, he set an excellent example. So what I am trying to point out is he really, the ethics of doing research, the ethics of Ottoman history, in the way he tried to approach and understand his historical actors with respect, with curiosity, and a sense of connection, a respectful connection to his historical actors, that that is very exceptional. And I think in that regard, trying to have this kind of connection with historical actors is one of his most important parts of his legacy in how to approach he had a way of connecting with the minds of historical actors like no one else, really capturing the spirit of the moment, the zeitgeist. Like he could look at a text and basically reconstruct the mental map of the historical actors or the era that we're talking about, like no one else could. And that is a very particularly, very exceptional talent and also an ethical approach. And so I wanted to underline this. And also the openness of his work. His students and the scholars he trained or he worked with continued his work in taking his work in different dimensions. He, even though he was very fond of certain themes and certain questions for his own scholarship. The 16th century, 15th and 16th centuries, the early modern era, of course, took the center was at the center of his scholarship, as well as questions of bureaucratic structures or apocalypticism, but also occult science and history of science in that respect, in that line of themes of curiosity. So made it possible for the field to be explored from that regard also. And again, I think I can say this because I am someone who is specializing in history of science and medicine, that approach started something really unique in Ottoman history of science and medicine, in the sense that really only with training with Cornell, I think allowed enabled for us to have a thorough training in Ottoman history, Islamic history, Mediterranean history, world history, and being informed in the perspectives and methodologies to train and produce like an Ottoman historian, but at the same time exploring new questions in history of science, history of medicine. And so combining that, that was, I feel very grateful for Cornell, Fleischer, and University of Chicago, and the intellectual environment that kind of fostered this kind of methodology, which I think would have been extremely difficult to explore in other contexts. So, and Cornell was also, again, in his legacy, in training his students, he always emphasized the importance of context, the importance of understanding not only the historical actors or the historical events, historical themes under investigation, but exploring the larger context. And again, he as a historian who understood and appreciated and connected well with the knowledge and understanding of that, the working knowledge of that context, he always emphasized the understanding. And that meant, again, for a student of Cornell or for someone who is trying to emulate that model, not only focusing on your immediate area of interest, but anything that might be related to it, right? Just kind of exploring and setting that larger historical context for understanding that world. And at the same time, Cornell emphasized the importance of text, that philological training, knowledge of languages and texts. This was something, again, that he really cared about. As Chris mentioned, it was not unusual to have, sessions with him, spending hours around the table, just reading text. Sometimes it would be just a few sentences, sometimes discussing the meaning of one word for hours, right? the classes we had with him. Again, it was a privilege to have had that experience firsthand with him that involved a very kind of, it taught us how important it is to understand the text. And again, thinking about the text and the competence and mastery of languages as a way of connecting with the historical actors, right? And oftentimes I have to say that appreciation of that philological excellence also came with the responsibility of, if you really do not understand the language or the text, or if you misunderstand it, it is possible to really miss a lot and come up with misinterpretations. And he was a scholar that was very critical of colleagues, students, or anyone in the field who did not show the deep, the profound level of commitment to understanding text that he did not possess, and he could be critical about that. And I think that is one of the legacies that we have inherited from him. And as a model, he taught us the importance of the importance of philology and textual criticism and appreciating and paying attention to text. At the same time, I don't want to suggest that it was all about texts. I would have to emphasize that Cornell scholarship also made it possible for an entire generation of Ottoman historians to explore Ottoman history beyond texts. He, again, with his connections with scholars from art history or history of science or historians from other fields, he also made it possible to understand and appreciate Ottoman history beyond text. And again, as in my own personal journey as a historian who works with materials, non-textual materials in understanding Ottoman history, I really appreciate that at least the possibility of Cornell opening up those new ways of thinking, the pioneering this new possibility of thinking about Ottoman history from like multi-dimensional thinking, right? And interdisciplinary study and thinking in many like multiple layers. And so in that, I should also say that as a mentor, as a professor, he gave his students really the space and freedom to explore their topics, not in the way that Cornell would want them to do, or he himself would do, but just giving them the freedom and the encouragement to explore their topic in their own way, to develop their own voice as a historian, and to develop their distinct new approach in their own studies. So in that way, I guess I should underline, Cornell's legacy, not only as a scholar, as a mentor, but also his personality in kind of fostering these relationships and in a way, opening up the exploration of these new subjects. And as Chris already mentioned, and I can only, echo what he said, the personal and the professional in the case of Cornell were not two separate realms. They were very well connected, and in the way that we learned from him and in the way that we hope to continue that legacy. And in my own personal experience, I think I know and appreciate how important it is to have that close connection between the personal and the professional. And I think on that note, I will stop here and we'll continue with questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Nükhet. To our organizers, I have a question myself. So I can see some questions that are sent by our participants in the Q&A, but can the audience see those questions? Whenever we answer, should we summarize or read the questions for the rest of the audience, or can they see it?
They should be seeing it as I
Okay.
know.
So everybody can see it under Q&A.
It's not a bad idea to summarize these questions. You've shared them with us, Kaya. I mean, they're excellent questions. They're very long,
Yes,
though, so we should try to,
absolutely. Absolutely.
yeah.
I can just go ahead and do that. So first of all, we have three questions by Deniz Saygı. And I should also say, I mean, these wonderful questions that we just received are a further testimony for me to Cornell's ongoing influence. These are questions by the younger generation of Ottoman historians, but okay, Stefan says that they cannot see the questions. So yes, I'll go ahead and summarize them. So all of the questions that we received reflect a very detailed, profound reading of Cornell's scholarship and also a reflection on what the possible next steps are. So I'm
Maybe
gonna,
just read it verbatim, if that's
yeah, I think so. Yes, let's do that. So first, I will read them in groups because we have three questions by Deniz Saygı, and here they are. First of all, Professor Fleischer convincingly demonstrated that late 16th century Ottoman bureaucrats, figures such as Mustafa Ali, were not merely clerical executors but active architects of ideological programs responding to structural strains within the empire. In reconsidering this fusion of bureaucratic self-fashioning, political rivalry, and fiscal turbulence, might we explore how these intellectual interventions functioned as sophisticated critiques of imperial expenditure, revenue misallocation, and the moral economy of office holding? And further, do you consider Fleischer's model of the bureaucrat intellectual to provide a viable analytical framework for reinterpreting Ottoman governance not as reactive, but as generative in its pursuit of administrative coherence? Chris?
Okay. I mean, it's really an excellent question. I mean, I think it kind of gets at the heart of, in some ways, some of what Cornell Fleischer was trying to do, I think, in the Mustafa Ali book. What strikes me about this question is, I mean, I think it plays on this tension between, approaching Ottoman history as articulation of institutional frameworks
Yeah.
and systems. You think about, the Timar system and the Waqf system. That Ottoman history itself is a definition of a number of systems that are understood primarily as institutional in nature. And then what Cornell was trying to do, and what he certainly did very successfully, was to articulate the human dimension that sits within that wider institutional framework. Cornell certainly paid a fair deal of attention to these institutional frameworks, but I would say that probably the heart of his scholarship, the thing that drove him, was the human dimension. It cannot be said that his scholarship was at the forefront of articulating a new understanding of the Tamar system or a new understanding of the institutional framework per se. So, I mean, I think what remains to us to do, that is to say, new generations of Ottoman scholars, is to try to find a way to synthesize these two approaches, so that you can say something perhaps new about the institutional framework, by making use of the personal and the human dimension. So the question you asked, Deniz Saygı was much more specific than that. Might we explore how these intellectual interventions functioned as sophisticated critiques of imperial expenditure, revenue misallocation, and the moral economy of office holding? I think that's certainly the case, and I think that was certainly the case for Cornell Fleischer and his book, and for many other scholars who, let's say, grappled with the Mustafa Ali book. Perhaps if they were previously approaching Ottoman history in a different lens, let's say, those who were more inclined to focus on the institutional side, when they read bureaucrat and intellectual, had to think about some of these questions a bit more pointedly. And then the second aspect, whether bureaucrat and intellectual provides a viable analytical framework. I mean, I think it did certainly for Cornell's book, and I think it has for a number of other people. Yeah, I think that if I think about Cornell's book, following Cornell's book, I mean, it's after Cornell's book that Halil İnalcık, for instance, begins to write, articles where, he's saying, well, the bureaucrats really did actually have a way of checking sultanic authority, because they had a way of, asserting a kind of bureaucratic outlook that even sultans had to pay attention to. So I think that we can see that impact in Cornell's work, and perhaps in some ways, I don't know whether Inalcik would agree with this, but I mean, maybe in some ways, bureaucrat and intellectual had a way in reframing how institutional, let's say, historians who are institutionally minded thought about some of their work.
So I would like to say a couple of things on the basis of this first question, but before I do that, may I ask our organizers to send those questions to all the participants? Can you do that via Zoom? You probably.
Yes, I can. I changed the setting. I'm so sorry for that. But I don't know if it goes backwards. That's why I will again send all the questions to the chat.
So let's send them because there is a lot to be discussed in these questions. And I really want the entire audience to see those because, as I was saying earlier, these are really wonderful reflections on what Cornell discussed. And also there are some very, very intriguing suggestions about the next steps. About the bureaucrat intellectual as model, I would say that Cornell didn't necessarily think of this as a kind of model. He did talk about bureaucratic consciousness, obviously, but Mustafa Ali as bureaucrat and intellectual is a rather exceptional case, and I believe he also saw it in that particular way. I also remember that he was very much influenced early on by Carlo Ginzburg and the microhistorical / biographical approach. So in his mind, Mustafa Ali was kind of a lens through which we could look at that particular period, with a level of unprecedented sophistication. But at the same time, he also knew how to distinguish between a bureaucrat and intellectual like Mustafa Ali and other bureaucrats who did not necessarily represent the same sort of intellectual sophistication, and yet, as Chris was saying, who did develop a sort of group identity and who did develop their own understanding of governance, their own understanding of finances, their own understanding of right and wrong, and they basically ended up instituting a somewhat small but yet very vocal sort of faction in the midst of Ottoman governance. Yes. So I assume now everybody can see the questions. I put them on a Word file myself. I cannot read the small font. Nükhet, anything to add, or should we go to question number 2?
Can Nükhet hear us?
I'm sorry, my internet connection
She's
is
looking
not
at the
stable.
questions.
I lost connection for a minute, but I'm back right now.
So we covered question number 1. Now, if you have anything to add to that, or we can go ahead to the second question.
Yeah, I missed just a little bit of, the discussion, maybe the last minute or so, but, very quickly, I just wanted to add something to it in the sense that, and in response to the question, so a historian's process of producing new knowledge and understanding as expressed in historical scholarship goes like in multiple stages, right? And
Oh no.
historians having their own style, having their own taste, having their own points of emphasis. And, we can also talk about the importance of times, fashions, trends, what is popular. And even though Cornell himself was not someone who was really affected by such, trends, but in the sense that that process of historical reconstruction will make certain decisions in prioritizing certain themes or actors and events and whatnot. And here I want to think of the historian's process of reconstruction like that of a novelist or that of like a filmmaker, because there is a process of almost like creating a fiction together. And in that, I want to bring back the question on like the Mustafa Ali and that book. I mean, what Cornell was trying to put together in that book as like the synthesis or the historical reconstruction, perhaps could have done in different ways, but none of the methods that could be used would have been as efficient and as really exemplary as using the case of Mustafa Ali and his mindset. And not only him, but the reading that entire generation or society and those who share the same cultural values and the mindset through one historical example. I just wanted to add that that process of historical reconstruction is also very closely connected to the story that the historian is trying to tell. And in that, with that respect, I think that is perhaps probably why Mustafa Ali book is an exemplary book.
Questions number 2 and 3, now that everybody can read them, obviously they're basically asking us to reconsider the Ottomans beyond the traditional approaches and to look at the Ottoman Empire in question 2 as a sort of empire that was much more connected and much less insular than it's being emphasized. And the question number 3 is asking us to once again reconsider the decline paradigm, but also by paying more attention to political economy. And I think the way I read them, Chris's work and Nükhet's work are already talking about these regional and global flows of information, but also microbes, disease, people, commodities. So in a way, this is an appropriate question to ask to a bunch of Cornell Fleischer students. And I guess like in these questions, I see Cornell's value and legacy shine through very much in the sense that we all were trained in a way to think about the Ottomans as part of a wider world at a number of levels, not only in comparison with Europe, but within the Mediterranean, within the Middle East, West Asia, the rest of the world, and all of that. So in that regard, yes, in our work, in our approach, the Ottomans are never insular. But I don't want to lose sight of another thing, and Cornell was very careful about this balance. We should always be careful about emphasizing the specificity of the Ottomans as well, and never lose their specificity in these comparative sort of frameworks. There's a difficult balancing game here that all of us are engaged in, but I would like to underscore it one more time. against the context of these two questions. Chris?
Yeah. Again, the question from is it two questions, further questions from Denis Saige are great. I mean, this one about trans-imperial intellectual circuits spanning well beyond Ottoman domains to include certainly Persian and Persianate lands, Arab scholarly milieus, etc., or the Mediterranean. It had a kind of unsettling effect, let's say, on how Ottoman historians did Ottoman history, let's say, and I think that that's probably right. The question then, posed by Denise is that one argue that such recontextualization obliges us then to reconceive of the Ottoman political economy itself as embedded in multi-directional flows of administrative techniques, monetary theories, and epistemic norms. I think that that's a really marvelous question. I mean, the short answer is yes. And then the question is, how do you go about doing that? I mean, I think that there are probably many, many ways to do that. All I can say is, something about what I'm trying to do currently, and that's to study Waqf, which of course, Waqf is not, is an Ottoman institution, but it is not solely or primarily an Ottoman institution. It pre-existed the Ottomans, and there were, all of the lands that the Ottomans arrived in the 16th century, Syria and Egypt and, Eastern Anatolia and Iraq and Western Iran. I mean, all of these places had Waqf. And so for me, part of the reason why I'm interested in studying Waqf is that it's one of these, it's an institutional structure that it goes beyond the Ottomans and yet was also quite important for the Ottomans. It's also one that, exhibits very clearly this human dimension that, Cornell was interested in, and that the question from Denise seems to suggest, different ways of approaching Waqf. How does that impact the Ottomans? I mean, this is a question which is a very important one for the research that I'm trying to do right now. So I would say, the very short answer is yes. I mean, the implications of what Cornell was suggesting are that we should take this kind of an approach. I mean, it's up to us to figure out ways to develop an approach that works and that makes sense. And I'm trying to do that through Waqf, but there are many, many other ways that historians can take it, another step or in a different kind of direction. Yeah, so a marvelous question. Thank you.
So I guess there's a good segue here into the questions. Sorry, you can go ahead. Sorry.
May I also add a few things?
Absolutely. Yes.
In response to this question, again, thank you for these excellent questions, really articulating and going to the core of some of what we want to bring out today, as part of Cornell's lasting legacy in thinking about state formation and empire and questioning that empire. I also especially really like the way Denis Saige, you framed the bureaucratic mechanism, organism as a term, of course, and also early patterns of formation, capital, and institutional innovation. And I see in the question really thinking about, my own work in the legacy, again, that Cornell said, and in the way that Chris remarked, there are multiple ways of exploring that set of connections, that set of networks that we call empire, right? And the importance of institutions, humans, cities, or it's possible to take it beyond the human organism or beyond the agency of humans, right? And in the last decade, several historians actually underlined the importance of changes in the environment and landscape and climate and other non-human actors like animals, plants, microorganisms, and their circulation. In my own work, I try to show how the Ottoman Empire as a mechanism, as a set of networks, made it possible for an unprecedented rate and diversity of circulation of both human and non-human actors that is actually like leading to what we call the early modern empire. I mean, early modern era is the one of the factors that is the pace of circulation of these organisms is at a rate that had not been experienced before. So there's something very new there. So really thinking about an empire, it is possible to approach this from various different angles. So it's open to new interpretations. Just wanted to add that.
Thank you, Nükhet. Again, looking at question number 3, we see some very important themes that were very dear and near to Cornell's scholarship. How do we see patronage? How do we reconcile the existence of patronage in a way, together with the existence of a kind of bureaucratic rationality? And how do we evade falling into the trap of replicating the decline paradigm approach? Again, all of these things are questions that he grappled with and he elucidated upon. I will say something very general, almost personal, but Cornell was a lifelong radical in the sense that he had no illusions about the modern capitalist state or the modern bureaucracy or any sort of political discourse that was being imposed upon us. Right? He was very much aware that things like patronage, waste of resources, all of those kinds of things were very constant features of the modern capitalist state, as well as any kind of pre-modern state-like governance structure. So he was very much free of these cliches and these prejudices, the Barkanian approach, trying to find a secular rational bureaucracy in Ottoman history, or the Weberian approach that glorifies a sort of modern rationalist bureaucracy. Actually, he would have been very pleased to see these kinds of questions coming from you. Yes, what we are looking at here is, as is articulated in the question, a constant struggle over the distribution, allocation, and reallocation of resources. This happens at any human society at different kinds of levels, and in the Ottoman case, we are looking at a variation of this. So beyond the decline paradigm, or beyond the search for the emergence of a rationalized bureaucracy, we really have to look at the whole picture that we have at hand. And this is where this loyalty to the sources becomes very important, because our sources do tell us this multifaceted story whereby patronage and a very rationalistic approach to bureaucracy can coexist. So our job is to render that sophisticated picture into writing, rather than picking a side or rather than trying to prove a point. So after this long and rambling answer, my short answer would be yes, absolutely. We are not bound by the decline paradigm, and this is exactly the kind of thing that we are looking at. Patronage, the development of bureaucracy, these are not mutually exclusive processes. Rather, they feed off of one another, and this is the kind of thing that he talks about in Mustafa Ali. Have a very rational, very well-educated, sophisticated person like Mustafa Ali can also be at the same time bound by these patronage networks, and he can kowtow to these worldly figures whom he sees as his inferiors, while also, writing these very sophisticated texts. How these two different things could coexist in the life of a bureaucrat. Anything? Should we jump to question number 4? We are segueing it more and more into this political economy questions, which I also like. So after the first 3 questions, we have 3 more questions by Bahan Yenilmez. And we are going deeper into political economy. So Chris, the number 4 looks tailored for you, actually.
Well, I don't know about that, but I mean, I think that Dr. Yenilmez's first question follows very well from Denise Saiga's last question. So if Denise asked about patronage networks during a moment of really profound change in the late 16th century, that's a question that is concerned with social dynamics as articulated through patronage, and the vehicle for patronage for many of these people were literary efforts. And this is where Dr. Yenilmez's question comes in, which is to say, how do we read these nasihatnames and other works which are clearly observing change in a certain kind of way? The question is, where is it exactly? Do you believe that treating these genres as active instruments in bureaucratic power struggles rather than as retrospective commentaries offers a more accurate picture of how ideas, policy, and personal advancement converged within the Ottoman state apparatus? I think the answer again is yes, and I think that probably that is how Ottoman historians have tried to approach these texts, perhaps especially after Cornell Fleischer. But I mean, it was not only Cornell who was concerned with a critical reading of these nasihatnames or these other kinds of works. I think by and large a rereading of those texts is how we've moved away from the decline paradigm, a kind of understanding of what they are, precisely in the terms that Dr. Yenilmez has outlined. So yeah, I think that's a major feature of scholarship in this vein, let's say in the last, well, at least 20 years. Yeah.
My 2 cents here would be to really keep rereading these things. I recently read Lütfi Pasha's Asafname for an article in an edited volume that I was doing. And of course, who hasn't read Asafname coming from our training? But I had read it in graduate school. And this time around, I have discovered completely new things about how Lütfi Pasha, not only as a disgruntled, retired bureaucrat, but as a genuine thinker on the best ways of managing, the Ottoman government, comes up with very, very critical, but also very innovative things to say. And he points out the really weak underbelly of the Ottoman system of, things like timar distribution of positions. This is, 40 years before Mustafa Ali. So yes, to this wonderful question, absolutely, we have to look at the totality of the sources that we have. And perhaps in the previous generations, this was one of the sort of methodological mistakes, but I want to believe that this has been superseded, starting with Cornell and his generation, and also with our generation of scholarship, in the sense that for us, a source is a source. We would never refrain from reading anything that is available, rather than limiting ourselves to being a scholar of Tahrir or something like that. So yes to that question, but that reading, that rereading is really one of the most important things that we have to do. I remember when I started working on Celalzade Mustafa, someone telling me, oh, Celalzade Mustafa has been studied. And my reply was, I have never heard a European saying, oh, Montesquieu or Machiavelli, they have been studied. You have no need of going back to them. So this is also kind of our job, to read and reread these things multiple times in every single generation. Nükhet?
And if I may also echo what's been already said, but really underline the importance of reading different genres, one against each other, and putting them into conversation with each other. This is really a methodological innovation that we've learned from Cornell, and we want to continue in that line. Really kind of the older bias, in a way, or methodological limitation of working with only one type of source has its own limitations. So really, to go over that limitation, I think the key is really to work with multiple genres and to bring them into conversation. And only in that way, I think we can really make, we're not really talking about the decline paradigm anymore in the same way, in the same vein today, but really making that differentiation between what is an historiographical artifact and what historiographical debate through genres, right? Like, reading these genres in conversation with each other is the only way to go beyond the limitations of the field.
So the second question by Bahan Yenilmez, and Bahan, if you don't mind, I will suggest that we somewhat answered your question number 3, because there's a new question about early modernity that I would like the 3 of us to address. I think this is an appropriate platform to talk about that a little bit. But as a quick reply to Bahan's question, again, I mean, I find this a very useful invitation to look at the economic side of things. Apocalyptic anxieties, can we tie them to major changes in the economy, in the demographic structure of the empire, population pressure, increasing prices? And this is the kind of connection that we know more from Europeanists, right? Because their sources are kind of different in nature. We are able to better match things like an increase in prices, the scarcity of certain commodities with increasing level of political contestation or apocalyptic anxieties. In the Ottoman case, we may venture to say, yes, there must have been a connection, but unfortunately, especially for Suleiman, it is very difficult to sort of create that kind of solid connection between the economy of the empire and these raising apocalyptic anxieties. Would be my quick answer to that. Yes, there must have been something like that, but our sources don't always allow us to establish that connection in a sort of consistent or coherent manner. Chris, what do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I agree. I mean, I think that this question actually kind of builds on the remarks that Nükhet made just actually a moment ago, which is, or in fact, her response is actually a response in some ways to this question, which is, I mean, Cornell's, insistence on putting different kinds of materials in conversation with one another. I mean, here, Dr. Yanni Lemez is actually calling for something even more profound, let's say, which is to say, how do you reread, highly literary, highly learned, scholarly texts on cosmographic and ethical, issues, let's say, really normative texts in a certain kind of way. How do you read them in conversation with, the quotidian, often mundane types of materials produced by bureaucrats on these kinds of fiscal matters? I mean, that's a great question, and that's something that I tried to do, let's say, I tried to do in my first book, and I not very well, but it's something that I want to do again and again. I don't know exactly how to do it, but it's something that I will say that I aspire to do. Yeah.
But in a way, Chris, during this discussion, I thought, your recent emphasis on socioeconomic, economic, legal history, all of those intersections, that's not necessarily a coincidence, but rather an extension of the earlier work that you have done. And I see a nice confluence of interest here in these questions that we received from Deniz and Bahan, and the kind of work that you recently embarked upon.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, I guess, I mean, the other thing that I would add is, I mean, in some ways, this Waqf project, well, first of all, I'll say that I'm having great fun with it. It's a big shift in some ways from what I was doing before. But I feel that I'm not abandoning what I did before, but I hope to find ways of incorporating it productively in the new work. So, I mean it when I say that, kind of synthesizing these two things is important. And that, if I go back to this metaphor that Cornell had about the skeleton and the tissue, I mean, I think about the period before the 80s in scholarship as one which is definition of the skeleton. And then I think a lot about especially the work that Cornell and his students and quite a few people in North America did in the 90s and 2000s, which is all about the tissue. And we need to have a balance because without a skeleton, the body is soft and will fall apart. So finding a way to synthesize these two types of sources, these two types of approaches is really important.
Yeah. So
May
I
I?
would, sorry,
I'm
go ahead.
sorry. May I just
Yes,
add
yes,
two
absolutely.
sentences?
Yeah, go ahead.
So, in the same vein, I think one of the issues in this, in response to this last question by Dr. Yenilmez, in addition to what's been already said, is about the anxiety for the uncertainties of the future, unpredictability of the future, which I think is really captures that moment in the early modern era with um, whether you look at science or whether you look at different genres or like, governance, empire building, running the apartment, the empire or demographic pressure, economic contraction, and all those that's been, listed in the question. So yes, it is very important to understand and study specificities of Ottoman history, which of course we're all trying to do. But I think we are now understanding more and more about the anxieties of the unpredictability of the future in the early modern period, that it was a moment that the world was changing in many ways, but it was also a world that was new and unprecedented in terms of biological changes in the world, right? I think in terms of world history, we're just putting together the nature of the early modern era in like the new that is embedded, and how it shapes that period, how it shaped the landscapes, how it shaped the climate, how it shaped the biological world and humans and everything else. And we're now trying to establish the links with what we know from Ottoman history with that general period. So I think as historians, as Ottoman historians in particular, we're still in the process of putting together, in the case of Ottoman history, but world history of early modernity has also need to kind of contribute to that context, and so we can establish.
So this also brings us to the final question. I want to wrap up by the half-hour mark, ideally, in order not to overburden our audience. But the final question is from Sam Stevens, and he's asking about Cornell's understanding of early modernity, what he would say. Yeah, Nükhet, you started talking about it already.
Right. I mean, I think it will be a good way of framing this entire discussion, because I think again we learned from Cornell, working with him to understand that the early modernity and the early modern period was a very special and interesting moment in human history. Important to understand how different traditions of knowledge or state building or even mentalities diverged. This for ways of thinking and the new ways of thinking. So there is empire and Ottoman history, but to be able to place it in that moment of change in early modern history is really critical. And I can see it in my own work, and so my colleagues are also looking at different aspects of Ottoman history, seeing the early modernity, like that monster that we're talking about, right? How to tackle with it. And I think Ottoman historians, and this must also be said in this context, Ottoman historians of the Ottoman Empire, have a very critical role to play in the larger study of early modernity in world history because of like the immense sources that we have and our ability to navigate between different types of sources, which is not the case for the study of, other early modern empires, for example, between the archival and the narrative and non-textual sources. It is possible to put together a narrative that actually will be at the forefront of the study of early modernity.
Good. Thank you, Nükhet. Chris, any remarks?
Yeah, well, I mean, I would this is a very direct, in some ways, deceptively simple question. I mean, I think the first thing I would say is that, Cornell probably had different ideas about whether or not early modernity fits with the Ottomans, and he was thinking about it over the span of maybe 30 years, and probably it's a question, that his thinking may have also evolved, with the field and, what the field was producing. If you go back to the 1980s, I think that he thought that this was a very fresh and entirely appropriate approach to Ottoman history. And, he was thinking alongside people like Rifat Ali Abul Hajj. So, in his, formation of the modern state, Abul Hajj says, we have a situation here in the 1980s where Ottoman historians cannot explain to their European colleagues what it is that they're doing and why it matters at all, because we are so insular in our study. It is so esoteric that what we're doing that nobody outside of this field has any idea what it is that we're doing. So that was the situation in the 80s, and it was people like Rifat Ali Abul Hajj and Cornell and Gülür Necipoglu and Cemal Kafdar and many other people who kind of expanded, let's say, what Ottoman history was for their Europeanist colleagues. And in doing so, they made the Ottoman Empire early modern in a way, I mean, in a historiographical sense. And I think that was a very important intervention and development. Now, that they were not the only ones who were concerned with this, and I do think that in different kinds of respects Cornell expressed some reservations about the direction of Ottoman studies, let's say vis-a-vis early modernity, that maintaining some notion of the specificity of Ottoman history is important, and that if you don't do that, certain kinds of distortions may come to the fore and may have a disproportionate effect on how we understand the phenomenon, the Ottoman Empire, whatever it is that we understand by that. So, to answer, the long story short is that I think he also had a kind of evolving attitude to this question. It's not a static response that he had, for all time.
Yeah, and that would be my first answer. And again, I hadn't thought of the Ottomans as early modern before I started working with Cornell in 2001. I had worked with Metin Kunt before, and one of the edited volumes that Metin Kunt did, you will remember, has early modern and Ottoman in the title. But I hadn't necessarily thought that this was something that I could follow up on even as a Metin Kunt student. But while studying with Cornell, it became a much more important concept, not as an orthodoxy. I never heard Cornell talking about the defining characteristics of early modernity or, a specific chronology, no straitjacket. But in his mind, as Nükhet and Chris mentioned in some detail, he really was very much convinced, and I love that self-confidence that he exuded. He was convinced of the relevance of Ottoman history for other historical fields, not only for Europe, but for other things, for Ming and Qing China, for just the early period of Joseon Korea, for Mughal India, right? Sometimes, Cornell students get these criticisms of being too Eurocentric. it is the opposite of what we aim to do. Rather, his use of early modernity and our use of early modernity is a push against, that century and a half of Orientalism, self-isolation, parochialism, nationalism, and all of that sort of stuff. What we are trying to do is to really represent the Ottomans on a number of different levels and give the Ottomans their due among dialogues with historians who work on other fields. And going back to something that Nükhet said, Cornell believed, and we do believe, that we have those sources. I have been working again on the Müşiat of Celalzade Salih, and it's a text that I read together with Cornell initially. But I mean, I cannot not admit the overwhelming similarity between the personality that emerges in Celalzade Salih's Müşiat. These are letters that he wrote between 1524 and 1555, and the letters of European humanists from the same period, right? I mean, I don't necessarily go into why they are similar or try to find specific connections or this and that, but they are clearly responding to a very similar environment of commercial capitalist expansion, state building, a different kind of connection that includes pandemics, but also ideas and this and that. I mean, we would not be doing our job properly if we fail to admit those kinds of things. And this is the reason why, we use early modern. I say almost jokingly, but I mean it not necessarily as an academic thing, but almost like as a political gesture. Because when we say early modern, we make the political claim as well as the cultural/academic claim that the Ottomans did belong to that particular period in world history. And Nükhet, as you described, this is clearly a very critical moment of rapid transformation on a global scale. So we are basically, as I said, trying to do a good job as historians by looking at these different levels and by placing the Ottomans, by making our sources relevant within, but also beyond Ottoman history, making the Ottomans legible without reducing them to anything else, Just to be able to say this is a reward in itself. Thank you so much for being here. It's very nice to see you. If you have any concluding remarks, let's offer them. If not, I think we can say goodbye to our participants and thank them for these wonderful questions. Thank the the Koç people for their help in organizing this and for hosting our Hoca's books. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank
We
you.
really thank our speakers again.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Okay, I'll sign off. Thank you all. Bye.
Thank you again.
Thank you so much. Bye.